If eudaemonism, the principle of happiness, is set up as the basic principle instead of eleutheronomy, the principle of the freedom of internal lawgiving, the result is the euthanasia, easy death, of all morals. Immanuel Kant. In my previous lecture, I explained the need for a moral law, if there is to be such a thing at all, as morality that is both universal and necessary. A moral law not coming from some outside source, be it a source that I find through experience, as the empiricist suggests, or be it a source that I find through my own reason, as the rationalist suggests, because that would then be a moral law that I don't follow for its own sake, and therefore not because I myself am moral. Rather, it would be a law that I follow for some other reason, maybe because there's the threat of punishment, or maybe because I'm promised something if I follow that law. Like, for example, if I base the moral law on God, then I would only act in a moral way because I want to get into heaven and avoid hell. Or if I base the moral law on my own moral feeling, my moral sense, my compassion, then I only act moral because it makes me feel good to help others and because I feel bad when I see others suffering. That cannot be a basis for actual morality. Rather, as Kant shows, there must be a moral law that is given to me by my own reason. A law that I follow not because I'm promised something for following it or because I'm threatened, but because I simply understand that this is the right thing to do through my reason, once again. And this leads me to the imperatives. And here, if you know anything about Kant at all, then of course you will probably have heard that the moral law to him is a categorical imperative. But what is, first of all, an imperative in general? Well, it is a principle of reason, reason here being practical reason. It is a principle of reason that reason tells us, so to say, we should follow. So Kant would say it has objective necessity, but not subjective necessity. What it means is, if I was a pure rational being like God, then there would not be imperatives for me. Because an imperative, you can translate that as a command or as an order of reason, right? That's what in Latin the word imperare means. It means to order, to give commands. So the emperor, or in Latin the imperator, he is basically the command giver, the order giver. And reason only gives orders to a being which is not necessarily reasonable, which could act in irrational ways. A being which, like God, is a being of pure reason, meaning, well, it doesn't have any incentive to not act in a rational manner. It has no senses, no sensuality, no sensual desires, so why should God not act rationally? So to him, reason doesn't speak through giving orders. He simply is rational. But we are rational beings that are also sensual at the same time, that also have sensual desires. And that is exactly why those principles of reason are necessary from an objective perspective. So we should act like that. But subjectively, for me as an individual, they are not necessary. I don't have to act like that. That is why reason speaks to us through imperatives. Well, and Kant says there are different kinds of imperatives, and he bases those on his table of judgments. I have talked about that in a previous lecture. I advise you to go and have a look at that lecture to understand this one better. Basically, Kant says there are 12 types, 12, you can say, forms or functions of judgments. All the judgments that we can make fall within one of those 12 forms. And, well, the imperatives that reason gives to us, they also must follow those forms. Because, after all, they are judgments, or rather they are conclusions of reason, meaning they are still based on this table of judgments. And that is why you can describe which imperatives there must be, through this table of judgments. This is Kant following his architectonic method. That too is something I discussed already in a previous lecture. To Kant, it is very important in science to not just look around and just look whatever you may find. Oh, there's this kind of imperative I can think of, and I can think of this type of imperative. That would only create an aggregate, like a pile of sand, where you can never be sure that you have all the pieces together, or maybe you overlooked something. Maybe there would be another imperative that you just haven't thought of. No, in science, the basic structure of the system should be based on an architectonic method. You should start from a principle, and from that principle deduce what types, what classes, so to say, there could be. And this architectonic principle is, to Kant, always the table of judgments, or the table of categories that are based on those judgments. However, he only describes the imperatives according to the judgments of relation and modality. That has a simple reason. The reason is similar to what I already explained in my lecture on what is dialectic. Because there I dealt not with practical reason, but with theoretical reason. And I explained that there are certain necessary ideas of our theoretical reason. The idea of the soul, the idea of freedom, the idea of God. And those ideas Kant also deduces as necessary ideas from the basic structure of our reason, meaning from the table of judgments. And there I explained well, quantity plays no role when it comes to reason and to reason's conclusions. In judgments, there can be judgments of quantity. There can be singular judgments where you are only judging about one thing. There can be particular judgments where you are judging about several things. Or there can be universal judgments where you are judging all the things. But when it comes to reason and its conclusions, it is always universal. It is always true for all instances. Reason doesn't know of exceptions. I mean, think of an imperative. For example, let's say you want to drive a nail into the wall, and your reason tells you it would be best to use a hammer. Don't use your hand, rather use a hammer. Well, this clearly is not just true for this one instance. Reason is not saying, well, right now a hammer is the best way to drive a nail into the wall, but maybe tomorrow, if you want to drive another nail into the wall, it would be better to use your hand. But no, it is always what you should do. So the imperatives of reason, they are universal. And that is why the quantity doesn't matter when it comes to what types of imperatives there are. There is only one type when you look at the quantity. And then when it comes to quality, there are affirmative judgments, negative judgments, and infinite judgments. Well, again, that doesn't matter so much for the imperatives, because that would lead to either affirming or negative imperatives or infinite ones. But that doesn't change their actual content so much. Like, let's say reason tells you, if you want to live, you must eat. That would be an affirmative imperative. Or let's say reason tells you, if you don't want to die, you must not eat. That would be a negative imperative, but they are both identical when you look at the actual content of the imperative. So that is why the quality doesn't matter either here. So Kant only looks at the relation and the modality. He says, if our choice, and I discussed what choice and what will is to him already in 2 lectures ago, if our choice is not to be ruled and determined by our sensual desires, by sensual stimuli, like it is in the case of the animals, but rather if our choice is to be ruled and determined by rational motives, by a rational reason of movement, that is by the will, by practical reason, then we must follow an imperative. And, well, to start off with the imperatives of relation, the judgments of relation were categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive judgments. So Kant says that there can be categorical imperatives. And to remind you, again, you can look at the lecture on the table of judgments. There I go into more detail. The categorical judgment would be one that just says a certain predicate belongs to a subject. So if I say dogs are mammals, or my t-shirt is red, or whatever, then, well, I have the subject. So I have dogs, I have the t-shirt, and I have the predicate of being a mammal, being red. And the categorical judgment has no further conditions. It doesn't say dogs are sometimes mammals, dogs are mammals when. It just says categorically dogs are mammals. All dogs are mammals. And the same would be true for a categorical imperative. In a categorical imperative, if there is such a thing, reason would not tell us you should do X if you want Y, but rather reason would tell us you should do X, you ought to do X. There is no further reason needed. X is not done in order to, but just you ought to do X. And just from that form, from that structure of the imperative, it should be immediately clear that this must be the moral imperative. That is exactly what morality is. Not acting for the sake of something else, but rather acting for its own sake, acting simply because this is good, this is what you ought to do. Like, of course, you can do a moral action also for other reasons, but then it is not truly moral. If I don't go and murder a person because I'm afraid of punishment, be it earthly punishment in jail, be it divine punishment in hell, whatever. If my only reason for not murdering someone is being afraid of getting punished, then this action of refraining from murdering is not done for its own sake. It's not done because I think that this is a good action as such, but rather it is done in order to achieve another, a non-moral, a selfish goal. Only if I don't murder someone simply because it would be wrong to murder him, simply because I have regard or reverence for him as a human being, only then is it a moral action. So, again, morality would mean following a categorical imperative. One that just tells me you ought to do this, no further reason, not to achieve another goal or whatever, not as a means to an end, but rather as an end in itself. And only a categorical imperative is considered a law by Kant. Because to Kant, law means a universal rule that applies, always. So that is true for the laws in the state. They should not have exceptions. They should be applied always. You can think also of the laws of nature or laws in mathematics or whatever. If you have such a law, by calling it a law, you are saying this is not just what is true sometimes, but rather you are saying this is what is true always. It is a universal law. All things in nature have to follow this law. On the other hand, there are also hypothetical imperatives. And remember that a hypothetical judgment was a if-then judgment. So, for example, if it rains, then the ground gets wet. Now it actually rains, so the ground gets wet. Or if you don't eat, then you die. Now you didn't eat, you got starved, so you die. So this judgment is not categorical. It doesn't say something is the case without further condition. It is hypothetical because it says something would be the case if something else, if a certain condition would be the case. And therefore, a hypothetical imperative would be one that tells you not you ought to do this, but rather you should do this if you want to achieve that. So the example I gave previously with the nail would be an example of a hypothetical imperative. If you want to drive a nail into the wall, then you should use a hammer. That is what reason tells you. But reason doesn't tell you you should use a hammer without further condition. I mean, it's not necessarily rational to always carry a hammer with you, to always use a hammer for everything. If you don't want to drive a nail into the wall, you don't need a hammer. So, therefore, the imperative is hypothetical. Only under this condition of wanting to put a nail into the wall, only under that condition is it rational to use a hammer. And here you clearly see that these imperatives have nothing to do with morality. Using a hammer is as such not a moral, also as such not an immoral action. These imperatives are just about how to achieve a certain goal, but they are not about what actually should be your goal. You could use hypothetical imperatives to achieve good and to achieve bad goals. And these imperatives to Kant constitute rules as opposed to laws, because while a law is universal to him, a rule is a principle that may have generality, but that could have exceptions, unlike a law. So this is the distinction of the imperatives according to their relation. Of course, there's one more type of judgments of relation, and that is disjunctive judgments. So it would be reasonable, if you go with Kant's architectonic method, to ask, are there disjunctive imperatives? Because, that is what the architectonic method is about to him. You don't just look around, you don't just think, oh, what imperatives I can think of those two types, but rather you make sure that you have a complete system, and you make sure through the table of judgments, because again, Kant believes to have found that those are the 12 forms in which we can judge. So all thinking that is possible to us, and that would therefore also mean all practical thinking, all thinking with our reason about what we should do, how we should act, all thinking we can do must happen within those 12 forms. And yet, I don't usually find disjunctive imperatives discussed. Like, not even their possibility. Are they possible? Or if not, then why not? This is usually not a topic that people discuss. I don't want to say that nobody ever discussed it. Maybe there's some professor here or there who mentioned it in some paper. But usually I don't find it discussed. Certainly when I studied and when I had a seminar on Kant's moral philosophy and on his groundworks of the metaphysics of morals, this wasn't mentioned by the teacher. And this speaks to a general issue. This goes to show that people, including professors, including alleged experts, they may read certain works of Kant, and they may even understand what Kant is writing there to a certain degree, but they take it in isolation. They take the specific topics, so in this case, practical philosophy, moral philosophy, in another case, theoretical philosophy, and they ask, what has Kant said there? But often they don't really have independent thought, and they are not really understanding it with their own free independent thought, independent of the letter of what Kant says and what he doesn't say. And what they lack especially is precisely this architectonic thinking of Kant. They are usually not thinking in systematic terms, but rather their thinking is a rhapsody of isolated thoughts. And that is why many don't come up with this thought. Even though it is a thought that if you take this architectonic method seriously, is pretty much a necessary thought. What about Kant himself? Well, the term disjunctive imperative is never mentioned in Kant's published works. Nowhere. If you don't just look at his published works, however, if you look at his lectures and at his private notes, then there are two mentions, one in the lectures, one in the notes. But both times there is not really a systematic discussion of disjunctive imperatives. It's more of a brief side note. A disjunctive judgment is, after all, a judgment that says either or. For example, either you are alive or you are dead. So a disjunctive imperative, one would think, would then be an imperative that tells you either do that or either do this. But one of it you must pick. Well, in his lectures, one time Kant mentions the scenario of a civil war, where you could decide which side to pick, which side to support, but you must support one side. Staying neutral is not an option or would not be moral. And then in his notes, there's one instance where Kant talks about adiaphora. So that was a term that originally was used in the confessional debates between Catholics and Protestants, especially from the Protestant side, which was a bit more lenient about some things. Basically, they said there are certain theological beliefs on which the Catholics and the Protestants may differ that are actually important. So if you believe or if you do the wrong thing here, then you're going to hell. But then some of the somewhat more lenient or liberal Protestants would say there are also maybe in the cult practices, so how exactly is the mass done, certain details of that, they are adiaphora, meaning they don't matter. You can do them our way, like we, the Protestants, do, but if one day you go to the Catholic Church and you partake in their mass and do it their way, that's also fine. That won't get you into hell. And Kant in his notes at one point discusses that and says that in morality there are no adiaphora. Something is either good or it is evil. There cannot be either or. So that's the only two times disjunctive imperatives are mentioned. I must say that is a bit weird. It shows that Kant was not always consistent, even though he himself stresses the importance of his architectonic method. He doesn't always properly apply it, but often kind of forgets to apply it, or often only applies it as far as is necessary for whatever he wants to achieve in that instance. Because he really doesn't seem to have put more thought into that. So I would say that it remains an open question, and it would be something that a proper philosophical scientist of reason, if there were any of those nowadays, should work on that question. What would a disjunctive imperative be, and can there be such a thing? And I would say to that, I can't go into detail about it here, because then I would digress completely and it would no longer be a Kant lecture. But I would think that maybe this would lead to the higher morality of Fichte. Maybe one could show that this higher morality, even though Fichte doesn't use that term, would be based on a disjunctive imperative. But be that as it may, that was more of a side note. When it comes to Kant, according to the relation of the imperatives, he really only recognizes the categorical ones, which are laws, and the hypothetical ones, which are rules. So the ones where reason tells you you ought to do this, and the ones where reason tells you you should do this if this is your goal. But if you don't have this purpose, then you also don't have to do this. But as I said, one can also categorize the imperatives according to their modality. And here there were judgments that were problematic, assertive, or apodictic. A problematic judgment was one where you judge, well, this could be the case, this is possible. An assertive judgment is one where you assert that this is the case. And an apodictic judgment is when you find that this must be the case. This is necessary. And what Kant says is hypothetical imperatives can be either problematic or assertive. Categorical imperatives have to be apodictic. So let's start from the top. There are problematic hypothetical imperatives. And let me remind you that a hypothetical imperative as such always says you should do X if you want to achieve Y, if Y is your goal. Well, such an imperative would be problematic if that goal, if that purpose itself is problematic. So if it is a purpose that one might have, but doesn't necessarily have. So these problematic imperatives, they can really be about achieving any possible goal. Again, the example I already gave, the goal of wanting to drive a nail into the wall, that would be, I use it as an example of a hypothetical imperative, but more precisely, it's a problematic hypothetical imperative, because this is a purpose that one's action could have, but doesn't necessarily have to have. Not everyone wants to drive nails into walls. On the other hand, an assertive imperative would still be hypothetical, so would still be telling us you should do this action in order to achieve that goal, not for its own sake, but it would be about a goal or a purpose of action that is not just one that we could possibly have, but rather one that we do have. So this would be an imperative that tells us how to achieve the one purpose that all human beings definitely have. And Kant says there is only one purpose that we all don't just possibly have, could have, some humans have, others don't have, but rather that we all share, and that is the purpose of happiness. So assertive hypothetical imperatives would be ones where reason tells us what to do in order to achieve happiness in life. And lastly, there are apodictic imperatives, and they are identical with the categorical imperatives. So whatever is apodictic, that is necessary, is also a categorical imperative, and whatever imperative is categorical must also be apodictic, must be necessary. And well, as I already established in a previous lecture, that is exactly what morality is, right? Morality is a necessary action. Necessary, not physically necessary, that is not one that we have to do, like physically necessary it is that we must die, for example, but certainly not that we must act morally, we can act immoral, but practically necessary. So one that is not just optional, but rather one that we should do. So this is not about a purpose that we could have, or about a purpose that we do have, like the purpose of happiness, but this is about a purpose that we ought to have. So that means there are three types of imperatives, and therefore there are three, you could say, practical attributes that a human being can have. The first types, so the problematic hypothetical imperatives, Kant calls them rules of skill. So the German word he uses here is Geschicklichkeit, and Geschicklichkeit would usually be translated as dexterity. And Kant even does use the Latin translation of dexteritas, which of course corresponds to the English word. But dexterity, I think, has this connotation of being more about your body, right? How you can use your body. So maybe it's needed in playing certain sports, walking on a rope, dancing, doing gymnastics, juggling with balls. And that is not what Kant means here. This is not about skills of your body, but rather this is about reason. So what he means is that this is the the ability, as I already said, to reach any particular goal that you might set for yourself. He also, instead of Geschicklichkeit, uses the word Einsicht, so only rarely, and Einsicht would be translated as insight. So you could also say there are rules of dexterity, or there are rules of insight. I choose to go with there are rules of skill, those imperatives. So Kant says insight because really all you need is insight into how nature works, insight into the rules, the laws of nature. And if you have that insight, then you have the skill to apply them. So, for example, if you know about chemistry, then you can create certain substances. You can create plastic, let's say, if you just know what you need to do in the laboratory. And these problematic hypothetical imperatives, these rules of skill, they are as such morally neutral, because again they help you to reach any possible purpose. So as Kant says, if you have the needed knowledge about medicine, then you can create a medicine, you can create a remedy in order to heal somebody from some illness. But with your knowledge, you probably also know how to create a poison in order to kill somebody. So the goal might be a good one, or it might be an evil one. It doesn't matter. Reason here just tells us how to reach a certain goal. And those imperatives of skill, Kant calls them technical practical imperatives, because this is about a certain technique. And here, of course, Kant isn't yet thinking of the modern word technology, which didn't exist yet. So our modern technology is also built through what he would call imperatives of skill, technical, practical imperatives. But rather the Greek word techne just means art. So art, not in the sense necessarily of aesthetical art, of beautiful art, but in the sense of, again, skill, of craftsmanship. So those technical, practical imperatives, they certainly have their importance. They are needed, both to serve the goal of happiness and to serve the goal of morality. Because the categorical imperative, the moral law, really only tells us to be moral, but it doesn't tell us specifically how to achieve our moral goals. So let's say you are by a lakeside and you see that there's someone drowning. Well, the categorical imperative would tell you, save that drowning person. But it doesn't tell you how to do that. Would it be the best action to jump into the water and swim over there and try to pull that person out? Or would it be the best action to call for help, or whatever? Would it be the best action to jump into the boat that is there on the shore and to drive out there with the boat? That in itself is not a moral question. The only moral question is, will you try to save that person or not? If you don't do it, you are evil. If you just let that person drown, if you try to save that person, you are good. But whether you do your good deed in a skillful manner that best achieves your purpose or not, that in itself is not a question of morality. So those technical, practical imperatives, those rules of skill, they are needed. They are also needed for morality in order to actually realize morality. But as such, they are morally neutral, and they could also serve an immoral goal. Like you could also you could skillfully save a person's life, sure. If you are, let's say, a surgeon or some other kind of physician saving someone's life who is ill, but you could also skillfully murder someone. You could use your reason to think about, how could I get away with murder so that it's not traced back to me. The second type, that is the assertive hypothetical imperatives, those Kant calls advice of prudence. Here the German word he uses is Klugheit, and Kant himself translates it into Latin as prudentia, which is basically the same word as the English prudence. But I will note that prudence in English is a word that is not used that often, right, in everyday language. While Klugheit in German is a more common word. Klug, the corresponding adjective, basically means smart. So you could also translate Klugheit as smartness. So these imperatives, they are advice of prudence or advice of smartness, because again, they are about how to become happy in life. And this is what being prudent or being smart means to Kant. So here it is important to note how Kant uses his words, to note what the Kantian terminology is, and to distinguish it from the way you might use the words in the common everyday language. Because what Kant calls Geschicklichkeit, and what you might translate as dexterity or as skillfulness, that would probably be called being smart in everyday language. Like if you can achieve any goal, if you know how to construct a certain technology or how to do a certain medicine, or also how to create a poison, if you know how to get away with murder or whatever, people would usually call that smart. But to Kant, it's just skillful, because while it is the ability to reach a specific purpose, a specific goal, that purpose might be a bad one. And by bad, I don't just mean bad in a moral way. I don't just mean evil. I also mean bad in the sense of dumb, in the sense of harming yourself. Like, you can very skillfully achieve a goal that will eventually come to bite you in the ass, right? You could very skillfully construct a bomb that blows up the whole city, including yourself. You have been skillful now, but you have not been smart or prudent. Or, because this is not an example of something that is very common, but in common life, people often go about reaching certain goals in a skillful manner without seeing the bigger, more holistic picture of whether that goal really serves their happiness. Like, for example, people may skillfully work on their career. They may work hard, they may work extra hours in order to get promoted, they may skillfully participate in some office intrigue in order to get promoted over somebody else. But I fail to ask the question, is this career really serving my happiness? Is this really what I want? Or maybe I'm hating this job, and maybe this hard work, overworking myself, participating in intrigues with other people, maybe this actually makes me unhappy and leads to a burnout. So that is why Kant talks of skillfulness or dexterity, but not of being smart. Being smart or prudent to him means doing that which will lead to your own happiness, doing that which really is good for you. So those imperatives, the assertive hypothetical imperatives, Kant calls pragmatic imperatives. To him, pragmatism always means asking, does this serve me? Does this help me in achieving happiness, or does this bring me unhappiness and pain? Well, and last, the categorical or apodictic imperatives, they are commandments of morality, Kant says. So we have rules of skill, of insight. We have advice of prudence or of smartness. And now we have commandments of morality. Because those imperatives, they don't tell me what would be the best way to reach a certain possible purpose. They don't tell me what would be the smartest or the most prudent action I could take, the one that best serves my interest in becoming happy. But rather, they command me to do something simply because it is good, because it ought to be done. And that is precisely why they are laws and not just rules or advice of our reason. And those imperatives, they correspond not to skillfulness or dexterity, and not to smartness or prudence, but rather they correspond to wisdom. I already gave a lecture on what is wisdom to Kant, and there I explained how wisdom is a moral quality. Wisdom is not about skillfully reaching certain goals or smartly, prudently reaching the goal of your own happiness, but rather wisdom is about your true vocation as a human being. It is about understanding what should be the highest, the ultimate purpose that you should achieve. And therefore, wisdom is necessarily a moral quality. And these would be the three, let's say, practical attributes that we can have as human beings. We can be skillful, we can be smart or prudent, and we can be wise. And maybe with this you can also understand better a remark I made recently in my lecture on what is the sublime, where I said that in certain instances where physical nature threatens and completely overpowers us, like if we are on a small boat in a stormy ocean, I said that here our skill and our prudence are at an end. It doesn't really matter if I'm the most skillful or the most unskilled and clumsy person. And it doesn't really matter if I'm the smartest, the most prudent, or if I'm the most short-sighted and dumb person. Because nature so overpowers me that these attributes, these that I may have or may not have, they don't matter anymore. They don't factor in anymore. But what remains in such a situation, I said, is my wisdom. Whether I'm wise or foolish, that still is important here, because with my wisdom, I can at least be calm inwardly. I can at least be stoic. I can understand that this physical world and even my physical existence, which is now threatened and which now I can't save, is not what matters, and I can understand that it is not wise to care about that which I can't change anyways. So these are the three types of imperatives which Kant recognizes. Technical practical imperatives of skill, pragmatic imperatives of smartness or prudence, and the moral practical imperative of wisdom. So he also stresses that practical philosophy can really only deal with the latter two. So with prudence, with achieving happiness, or with wisdom, with morality. And that is because I already discussed in my lecture what is philosophy, the distinction between theoretical and practical philosophy. And Kant there says that theoretical philosophy is about what is, it is about nature and the laws of nature, and practical philosophy is about freedom and how we should use our freedom. Practical philosophy is about what we should want, so to say, what our will should want. And our will can really only want happiness, so our own, whatever is best for ourselves, our own private interest, or it can want what is good as such. It can have a moral interest. The imperatives of skill, Kant would say, are not truly practical, because here the will is already determined. I already want something. The question is just what is the best means to achieve that purpose. And my reason is just used to come up with the best means towards that end. But the end itself is already set. Like, I already know, for whatever reason, I want to drive a nail into the wall, for example. And now the question is just, what is the best tool to use? Should I do it with my hand or should I do it with a hammer? So in the end, the imperatives of skill, the technical practical imperatives, they always must serve the pragmatic or the moral practical imperatives. I always already have the pragmatic goal of becoming happy or the moral goal of doing whatever is good. And also, this skill, it only really requires understanding of how nature works. That's precisely why Kant calls them, those imperatives, those technical, practical imperatives, not just imperatives of skillfulness, but also imperatives of insight. Because if I have insight into the laws of nature, then I can apply them. For example, let's say my goal is to fly, to build a flying machine, to build an airplane. I only need theoretical knowledge, how nature works. I need knowledge about aerodynamics and so on. And then I can build an airplane. Because again, when Kant talks about skill or about dexterity, it is not about skill of our body, something that is actually to be trained, like walking on a rope. But rather he is talking about things that I can do, that I'm able to do, as soon as I know them, as soon as I understand them. Like how to use a certain machine, for example. If I know by pressing this button I turn on my computer, then I'm also able to turn on the computer. The knowledge directly gives me the skill to do it. I don't need any further training to apply that knowledge. And therefore, this is not practical. This is really only about having theoretical knowledge and now applying it in the service of practical action. The three kinds of imperatives, they correspond to the three faculties of our thinking. Because Kant says the thinking faculty is made up of the intellect, the power of judgment, and reason. And if you want those further explained, I already made lectures about each of them. And the intellect is our faculty of concepts or of rules. The intellect, or you could also translate it as the understanding, it is that faculty by which we understand things, which we understand what they are. So, for example, I have a concept of what is a dog. That means I understand the rules that apply to dogs. I understand that, for example, all dogs are mammals. Or I have a concept of what is water, means I know the rules applying to water. I know that, for example, water boils when it's 100 degrees and it freezes when it's 0 degrees. And this is something, if I know those rules, if I have a correct concept in my intellect, then it gives me the skill to do something. So, for example, if I want to boil water and I have the correct concept of water, knowing that it boils at 100 degrees, then I know what I have to do to boil it. I know I have to heat it to 100 degrees. So, for those technical, practical imperatives, the intellect is enough. I just need to have correct concepts in my intellect. The pragmatic imperatives, the ones of prudence, of smartness, they require power of judgment. Here, I cannot just be given a rule that I could blindly follow in all cases in order to be happy, but rather I need to judge case by case what would be the most prudent action here, what would be the one action that most serves my interests. And lastly, when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to morality, what I need here is reason. The reason being the faculty of principles, that is of a first basic law from which everything else can be deduced. The moral law is such a principle, and I require reason to know how I should act. I will also note that I talked about those three, you could say, practical attributes of skill, prudence, and wisdom. I talked about them from a practical perspective now, from the perspective of practical philosophy. Kant says that we can also look at them from a more anthropological perspective, and especially when it comes to the middle one, to prudence or smartness, he often does so. He often discusses it less in practical and more in anthropological terms. And here, when it comes to anthropology, to him, prudence or smartness is about being able to deal with that which is not completely under our control. Because again, skill is just about using our intellect, having the right concepts of things, understanding the rules according to which things work, and then applying those rules. And if we have correct understanding of nature, we really have the skill to control more or less all of nature. So everything that is, so to say, mechanical would fall under skillfulness. But Kant says there are things which we can't completely control through simply understanding them, and that is mostly human things. And that is human things both in me and in others. Because in myself, I have my own feelings, my own desires, and those I can't necessarily completely control simply by understanding them, but rather I have to deal with them in a prudent manner. I have to understand myself. I have to deal with how certain situations make me feel, or with certain desires and inclinations I may have. I have to be careful to not be the slave of my desires, but rather to rule over them, to govern them. And even more so, Kant says, this is true when we deal with other people. We can't completely control other people because their choice is free. Nature, I can, if I understand the laws according to which it works, then my free choice can control nature and the mechanism of nature. But other human beings, I can't so easily control because they have their own freedom. So being smart, being prudent in that way, in that anthropological sense, by Kant is mostly understood as a social skill, knowing how to deal with other people, knowing even how to manipulate other people, knowing how to talk to other people in order to be liked by them or in order to get from them whatever you want, knowing how to sway other people, knowing how to hold good speeches, or knowing how to flirt correctly or whatever. All that would constitute being smart or being prudent. Kant likes to give the example of a clockmaker, and he says in order to construct good clocks that work well, he only needs skill. But in order to sell his clocks, he doesn't just need skill, he needs to be smart or prudent. Because he could create the best clocks in the world and still fail to sell them. Because he can't convince people maybe that they are actually good clocks. So being able to convince people, being able to haggle and get a good price for your product, or knowing how you have to make the reclaim for your product, knowing how to do commercials that actually drive people to buy your product, that would be about prudence. And we could add to that wisdom would be if the clockmaker asked himself, should I even be a clockmaker? Should my goal be to sell as many clocks as possible? Or should I maybe do something else in life? Because what serves me, what is smart for my personal happiness, is not always necessarily good, right? Just now I got recommended when I open my emails. Of course, there are always news articles that they recommend you, and I got recommended an article. The headline was, is now the right time to invest in Rheinmetall stock? So that's a big company here creating arms, creating weapons. And sure, with the wars going on in the world, with the United States abandoning Europe, and Europe probably for that reason producing more arms, with Israel still not being done with its genocide, maybe it's a great time to invest in a company that produces weapons from the perspective of prudence, from the perspective of wanting to make money. But of course, from the perspective of wisdom, the answer would be no, it is not a good time. It is never a good time to invest in the stock of an arms producer. Rather, if you do that, you are absolute scum of the earth. If you try to make money through the death of other people, if you try to make money through genocide and war, then you're an evil person. And actually, the person who wrote that article, who even asked that question, and who presumably, I didn't click on it, answers it from the perspective of mere smartness, not asking the moral question at all, that person is also an evil person, very clearly. So that would be the difference between those three attributes. And when reading Kant, you have to be mindful a little when he uses the word prudence or smartness. Does he mean it in the practical sense of doing whatever brings you happiness? Or does he mean it in the anthropological sense of being able to deal with that which is not completely in your own control, meaning your own emotions, your own desires, and even more so meaning other people? So Kant himself would stress that those two definitions of prudence are not necessarily contradicting each other, because Kant believes that our happiness mostly depends on that which is not fully in our control. It mostly depends on how we deal with our own passions and desires, and how we deal with other people. And especially how we deal with other people. Kant would say that our happiness is mostly dependent on other human beings. He says that if you were stranded on a lone island, in order to be happy or to be content, to lead a somewhat good life, you don't really need prudence or smartness in that situation. All you need is skillfulness. You need to have the skill, you need to know how to build a shelter for yourself, you need to know how to make fire, you need to know how to hunt, and so on. But if you have those skills, even without being prudent, you can lead a good life. But as soon as you are together with other people, as soon as you are in some sort of society, now you need prudence in order to deal with those other people, in order to not be ostracized, but rather to be well liked, in order to get ahead, to achieve your goals, to achieve that social position that you want. So in that sense, prudence is mostly needed in regards to other human beings. Kant would also say this is this more anthropological definition is the reason why this is not an attribute of God. So when it comes to God, we would call him wise, but we would not call him skillful, nor would we call him smart or prudent. It would indeed even sound somewhat belittling of God to call him that. And that is precisely because God is almighty, right? So wisdom is a quality we can ascribe to him and is something he needs, because wisdom is about asking, what should I do ultimately? What should be my ultimate purpose? But skill would be about using the rules of nature to achieve a certain goal. Well, God doesn't have to do that. If he's almighty, if he can do whatever he wants with nature. And also prudence, if it is mainly about dealing with that which is not completely in your own control, dealing with your own emotions, dealing with other free beings, well, there is no such thing for God, which is not completely in his control. If he is almighty, he doesn't need prudence. That is why out of those three, let's say, practical attributes, we would only ascribe the third one, only wisdom, to God. That is not to say that we can ascribe to him the opposites of the other two. Like, just because God isn't prudent or God isn't smart doesn't mean that he is dumb. But rather, that whole category, whether in the positive or in the negative way, cannot really be used when it comes to God. Only for beings such as we are does it make sense to speak of these three qualities. And when it comes to smartness or prudence, since Kant has these two slightly different definitions, he says that prudence or smartness in the anthropological sense, so mainly how you deal with other human beings, that could also be called cleverness or slyness. Or he also calls it the world prudence, prudence in dealing with the world. While the prudence in the practical sense, knowing how to achieve your own happiness, that would be the proper prudence or the private prudence. I will also note that it is mainly in this anthropological sense when Kant talks about the opposite of prudence and of wisdom, when he talks about foolishness. I already mentioned that briefly in my lecture on what is wisdom. Here we have a slight problem in English because there's only the one word fool, while in German there are two words, Narr and Tor. And Narr is more of a literal translation of fool, because a Narr is not just an idiot, but rather a Narr can also, like the fool, be the court jester, making fun at the king's court. While the word Tor is generally also translated as fool into English and does have a very similar meaning. It is, maybe you could say, a bit of a more friendly word. So it's not quite a big of an insult when we call someone a Tor as when we call him a Narr. The Tor is someone that you could pity for his foolishness, while the fool really isn't. So the fool in the sense of the Narr. And the way Kant uses those words is the Narr is he who is not prudent, and the Tor is the fool in the sense of not being wise. That means that a Tor is foolish because he has the wrong goals. He isn't focused on what really should be his highest purpose, but rather something that is only a secondary purpose or only a means to an end or whatever. He elevates to the highest purpose, for which he sacrifices everything else. The prime example for Kant would be the infatuated fool. So if someone is very much in love, very much crushing, and he sacrifices everything for that. He makes a fool out of himself. He sacrifices his social standing. He sacrifices his wealth for this infatuation of his. That would be a Tor. On the other hand, the Na is not just not wise by picking a secondary purpose and making it his highest purpose, but rather he is not prudent because he is acting against his own goal. It's not just that his goal is not a good goal, but even if we put that question aside, should this be his purpose or not, the problem is that he goes about it the wrong way and therefore defeats his own purpose. Here, Kant's prime example would be a miser, a person who is stingy, because that person tries to become rich, tries to amass wealth, and therefore doesn't spend money. So he only eats water and bread, and he only wears old, tattered clothes. So he basically lives like a poor person because he's so scared of losing his money and becoming poor. But if he lives like a poor person anyway, what good is it that he is actually rich if he doesn't use his richness? So he defeats his own purpose. The same is true, Kant would say, for the arrogant person, because he wants everyone to respect him and to hold him in high esteem. But for that reason, he treats everyone else as a lesser being, which of course defeats his purpose, which of course leads to the opposite, leads to everyone despising him. So that would be the two types of fools. The Na, who is not prudent, who defeats his own purpose, and the Tor, who is not wise because he picks the wrong purpose. But anyways, back to practical philosophy. To Kant, this means that practical philosophy could either be the doctrine of wisdom, that is moral philosophy, or it could be the doctrine of happiness, that is philosophy about how to lead a good life. And I already discussed that in the lecture on what is metaphysics, that to Kant the philosophy has a pure part, a metaphysical part, and it has an applied, an empirical part. And when it comes to theoretical philosophy, the pure part is the metaphysics of nature, is theoretical metaphysics, and the applied part is natural science. And I said, when it comes to practical philosophy, the pure part is metaphysics of morals. That would be this doctrine of wisdom, this moral philosophy. And the applied part, the empirical part, you could say, is this doctrine of happiness. There cannot be any other type of practical philosophy. There cannot be, if practical philosophy as such is the philosophy of freedom, of the laws of freedom, of how to make use of our freedom, how to act, then there cannot be, because there are only these three types of imperatives, there cannot be another type of practical philosophy except that which asks, how should we act? What would be a good action, a morally good action? Or what action would be in my own interest? What would be a prudent action? What would be an action making me happy? Kant says the only third option would be doing practical philosophy as a doctrine of skill. But that is not a proper practical philosophy to him. That would be a practical philosophy that teaches how to reach any goal that you might have, how to follow your whims as they overcome you. An example for a proponent of such a teaching in antiquity to Kant would be Aristippus of Cyrene. And in his own time, in the 18th century, it would be someone like La Métrie. So basically hedonism. Both are proponents of hedonism, but not a higher hedonism, not a prudent hedonism that is about leading a completely happy life, because then we would again deal with practical philosophy as the doctrine of happiness. And here the example of a philosopher for that would be Epicurus. That would be Kant's main example. And Epicurus is someone he respects, but Aristippus and La Métrie he doesn't respect. Because this is hedonism the way the word is usually understood nowadays. So cheap, base, short-sighted hedonism. Practical philosophy as a doctrine of skillfulness would teach us how to follow our most base instincts, how to follow our most short-sighted whims. It would be, Kant says, basically a sort of utilitarianism. He doesn't use that word because it didn't exist yet, but it would be a sort of utilitarianism that calculates in every instance what would be the most useful, the most beneficial action here in this specific instance, without looking at the bigger picture, without looking if ultimately this will serve me or will drive me into an early grave. Because maybe seeking hedonistic pleasure in the moment, like seeking drugs, seeking sex or whatever, will leave me ill or will leave me addicted down the line. But this would just be a short-sighted utilitarianism that is there to calculate what is most beneficial in this moment for me, which, as Kant calls it, would be the philosophy of scoundrels. And this, he says, this doctrine of skillfulness would be a disgusting doctrine, because this short-sighted hedonism, this is, it is a teaching of wantonness, he says. So he puts that aside as not a proper option, and that only leaves the other two kinds of practical philosophy, the doctrine of happiness, such as Epicurus teaches, or the doctrine of wisdom. And that means if we ask what should be, or what could be even, the highest practical principle of our actions, there are only two possible principles, Kant says. One is Eudaemonism. That would be the principle of happiness, because eudaimonia is the Greek word for happiness. And the other would be what Kant calls eleutheronomy. That is also Greek, and basically eleutheros is free, to be free, and nomos is the law. So eleutheronomy is free lawgiving, or freely following the law, or following the law of your own freedom. So that is basically the actual moral philosophy. And those are the only two possible practical principles that can guide our actions. Here you can hopefully see the great advantage of Kant's systematic and architectonic thinking. And here you can see why, as I like to say, if you want to study philosophy properly and thoroughly, so if you are not just interested in hearing about this or that position of this or that philosopher, but if you want to truly and thoroughly study and understand philosophy, I firmly believe you should start with Kant. Because he is so architectonic, meaning it's not just about Kant's own position, but rather he helps you understand all possible positions that one can have in philosophy. And he helps you make sense of those positions. So even if you were to disagree with Kant's position, if you were to reject his eleutheronomy, and were to choose Eudaemonism instead, still it would be beneficial to study and to understand Kant, simply to understand that those are the two possibilities. If practical philosophy is about acting in a rational manner, because of course you could also act like an animal only based on instincts without thinking at all. Your choice could be driven by mere sensual drives, but then you don't need practical philosophy, because this is precisely about acting without thinking. But if your choice is to be determined by a rational spring, an intellectual spring, that is by a motive, only then do you need practical philosophy. And if you agree with Kant's architectonic, that there are only three ways in which reason can be practical, out of which the first, the skillfulness, is not truly practical, because here you are only applying theoretical reason to reach your goals, but you are not otherwise using reason for your goals as such, that only leaves those two possibilities. Either your reason is a tool that is used for the goal of happiness, which as such is not a rational goal, but rather a goal that comes from our sensuality, right? As sensual beings, as animals, albeit intellectual animals, we want pleasure, we want happiness. So either reason is a tool to achieve a goal which doesn't come out of reason itself, or reason itself gives the law, doesn't just tell you how to achieve a non-rational goal, but sets a goal which is rational, sets the goal of morality. There is no other option besides those two, and that is what you can learn from Kant, even if you disagree with what should be your goal. And then you can better understand not just Kant himself, but also other practical philosophers, other moral philosophers, because now you can look at their moral principles and ask what is ultimately their guiding principle. Because the question for any practical philosophy is which of those two principles has precedent over the other. Now, Kant is not of the opinion that happiness and morality are necessarily at odds. That is an often held opinion. Many people seem to think that basically you are stupid if you are good. Being good is acting against your own interests, and being evil is serving your self-interest. Kant rejects what he calls the virtue of monks. So he rejects this total asceticism and the death of the flesh, and believing that in order to be good you have to abstain from any pleasures and any happiness. No, that's not at all Kant's position. He is not saying that it is wrong to seek your own happiness. I will also talk in a later lecture about what Kant himself says about how to lead a happy life. And in general, Kant actually teaches that both the goal of happiness and the goal of morality align more often than not. Usually, the prudent action and the moral action are one. And this goes for both parts of his moral philosophy. I will talk about this in more detail in coming lectures, but both when it comes to ethics, so the actions of the individual, how you should act, and when it comes to the philosophy of justice, so how the laws between human beings should be, how the state should be constituted, and how states between one another, how international law should work. In both cases, Kant believes that usually being prudent and being wise is the same. So when it comes to individual ethics, it would usually lead to the greatest happiness to do what is good. I mean, just look around. Sure, some evil people may be successful. They may have lots of money, but are they truly happy? Do they have friends? True friends, not just people that they deal with, that have certain goals for a certain time that they have in common with, but rather, do they have actual friends? Do they have people they actually love and who actually love them? If you treat everyone with disregard, if you treat everyone as an asshole, no one will like you, no one will be loyal to you. And likewise, sure, you can try to satisfy any desire you might have, but you will usually be more happy if you are a moral person, living with self-regard and being independent, being free of your own desires, not being their slave, not needing them fulfilled in order to feel good, but rather being content with less, needing less. Not being unhappy just because you can't buy that new car, or you can't buy those expensive clothes or whatever. Not being all about status or whatever. And the same, as I said, the same is true for the philosophy of justice. The same is true for the state. We often seem to think that what benefits a state is basically acting in an evil, acting in a ruthless manner, right? So saying America first, for example, and not caring about what happens to other states. But is that really the most prudent course of action, to make everyone your enemy, to disregard international law, to maybe lead to a world where there is no international law and there's just the rule of the jungle and just the reign of the strongest and the most ruthless? That could come back to bite you in the ass. Or likewise, when it comes to something like climate action, that is a big topic, or was in the debate for the last years here. People always pitted the economy against the climate, basically saying, oh, if we save the climate, then our standard of living will go down, it will harm our economy. But the fact of the matter is that, of course, climate breakdown will harm our economy much more. Even now, it already does. Just some years ago, we had a great flooding here in one valley. Some villages were flooded. Over 100 people died, and there was great economic damage done. It still isn't repaired, and billions were lost. And this is really just a small thing. as this progresses, as the climate gets worse and worse, what happens when the North Atlantic circulation breaks down and the climate of Europe will be completely messed up? What happens when there's the weather becomes too dry, there's a drought and there's no rain anymore, and our farmers can't grow food anymore? This will harm our economy much more in the long run. So Kant would stress that usually prudent action and wise action leading to your own success and action leading towards what is good, usually they align. Only this moral philosophy, only this practical philosophy understood as the doctrine of skillfulness, of reaching a short-term goal, not thinking about the long-term effects, only this philosophy of the scoundrels, only that would be in stark contradiction to the doctrine of wisdom, to moral philosophy. But still, even though being smart and being wise usually align, there can, of course, be situations where they don't, even if those are extreme situations and not normal situations. So let's say you live in the days of the Nazis and there's some Jew who's fleeing and who's begging you to hide him. Here, of course, the prudence thing would be to not do that, because if it is found out that you hit a Jew, then not just him, but you are also going to die. The prudence thing would be to just stay quiet, just accept the Nazi rule and not do anything against them. But the wise thing, the moral thing, of course, would be to hide that Jew or to actually act against the Nazis, to protest like the White Rose did. And in such situations where prudence and morality don't align, here the question is, what should come first? Because you can't be both in this situation. You can't be prudent and moral. This is exactly the point. So you have to have a priority for one or for the other. And this is where you have to decide, am I a eudaemonist who mostly cares about his self-interest, about his own happiness, or am I an eleutheronomist who mostly cares about the moral law, even if the price is his own happiness? And Kant, of course, is on the side of eleutheronomy. And it is his great achievement in moral philosophy, again, in both parts, in the individual ethics, as well as in the philosophy of justice concerning the state, to have shown the error of Eudaemonism. But again, even if you wouldn't go with Kant, it would be of value to understand that those are the two possible principles, and that every moral philosophy, even if on the surface level, in the details, they might seem to be very different, can be reduced to one of those two options. I already criticized in the previous lecture that nowadays, when practical philosophy is discussed, even at university, but certainly in videos here on YouTube or on Wikipedia and articles or whatever, there are these categorizations saying there are deontological theories and utilitarian theories and compassion ethics and virtue ethics and so on. And I criticize that this is not scientific. This is just looking around empirically finding different moral positions, trying to describe them, trying to categorize them. This just creates an aggregate, a pile of sand. You can never be sure if you have found all the moral theories, or if maybe there's something you overlooked, or that no one has come up with yet, but someone could come up with in the future. And you can also never be sure if the ones you did find, if they really are different categories, or maybe one of them is just a subcategory of the other. Well, the categorization Kant does with those two categories is based on architectonic principle, and therefore a priori, that is, before looking around, before asking what specific positions did this or that philosopher take, a priori that there can only be those two positions, that nothing else could ever be come up with. And if you think about it, you will find that the four possible explanations for morality, which I discussed in my previous lecture, and which with Kant I showed to be wrong, they all share the same common flow. They all are eudaemonistic. So the empiricism, be it inner or outer empiricism, and the rationalism, be it inner or outer rationalism. It doesn't matter if you base morality on what the law of the land or the customs of the people say, or whether you base morality on your own inner feeling of empathy, or whether you base morality on God's commandment, or whether you base morality on what is perfect. In each case, the issue is that you base it on something else than morality itself. In each of these cases, you are not acting moral for its own sake, simply because it is your duty, simply because it is the right thing to do. But rather, in all these cases, you are acting moral because you will benefit from it, because it will bring you happiness. If you don't act against the laws of your country, you don't get punished. If you act according to your compassion, to your empathy, you will feel good about helping other people, while otherwise you would feel bad at seeing them suffer. If you don't act against God, you go to heaven and not to hell. And again, even if you try to do whatever is perfect, even that ultimately is about your happiness, about your own perfection. So all of those have in common, and that is precisely the reason why all of those are wrong, that they follow, as different as they may seem on the surface, they come from the same roots. They follow a eudaemonistic principle of ethics. But Kant proposes a rationalism which is not objective, which is not dogmatic, but which is subjective and critical. So using reason for morality, sure, but not using reason to find a moral law outside of yourself, like one that God may have given, or whatever is objectively perfect, because then you would still need an extra reason why you should follow that law. And that reason in the end could only be that it benefits you to follow it. It brings you happiness to follow it. No, Kant's principle of morality means using reason not to find something outside of reason, but to stay within reason. Using reason to give yourself a rational law. That is exactly what eleutheronomy, free lawgiving, means to Kant. And in that sense, I hope that it becomes somewhat clear here that Kant's moral philosophy is not just a better, more correct moral philosophy than that of others, but rather it is the only moral philosophy. And any practical philosophy that isn't aligned with it is not a moral philosophy at all. It is not a doctrine of wisdom, but a doctrine of happiness. It is a eudaemonistic philosophy that is ultimately about your self-interest and not about doing good. All those other teachings, they can only promise you things, benefits, if you act in a good manner, or they can only threaten you if you don't act in a good manner. But they can't really say that it is your duty, and that if you don't do what is good, you have done evil, you are guilty now, you are responsible now for doing evil. They can only say if you don't act good, you haven't acted prudent, you haven't done what would have benefited yourself. And this is not just wrong as a moral philosophy, this is very dangerous, and even in itself evil, Kant says, because ultimately what it would mean is to say that the moral person and the evil person are at the root are not different from one another. In their inner quality, in their posture, in their will, they would be the same. Both would be people who really only serve their own interests. And you could only say that the virtuous person does so in a smarter way, while the person of vice does so in a stupid way, in a way that ultimately harms himself. You could say, well, one person maybe would have liked to kill somebody, to take revenge on somebody, but was prudent enough to tell himself, well, if I take revenge on my enemy, if I kill him, I will go to jail, and that's not worth it. So therefore he abstained from the revenge, while another person did take revenge and did kill that other person, thinking taking revenge would bring him happiness, and therefore ended up in jail, ended up unhappy. They are not different when it comes to their will. They are not different when it comes to how good they are as people. They are only different in how short-sighted or how far-sighted they are, how smart they are. That's not a moral quality. So that is why Kant completely rejects every eudaemonistic principle of morality, and why he says no, true morality must be eleutheronomy, and you must follow not a merely hypothetical imperative where reason just tells you how you can reach the goal that you already have, the goal of happiness, but rather you must follow a categorical imperative where reason sets the goal itself. Now, what that actually entails, what is the categorical imperative content-wise, what is the goal that you should have, that I will save for a later lecture. But here it was important for me to first explain these are the possible imperatives we can follow. These are the possible practical principles that a philosophy can follow. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.